Welcome back to our final lecture of geography this week. Today we're going to be talking about something that is going to be important because we're going to spend the next entire week talking about one specific area of Africa. And so we're going to do the background for that area of Africa this week, simply because we're going to have so much to talk about next week. And that area is South Africa. And the reason that I have chosen to focus on South Africa the next week is because it's a very unique situation in African history. And I think it really is something that we as Westerners need to understand. There's a lot of tensions that are created in South Africa. And in fact, South Africa still comes up today. If you've ever heard the word apartheid, and I'm sure that you have at some point in your life, that obviously comes out of South Africa. And so understanding apartheid, what it was, what the South Africans did, and how we can avoid being in that situation is very important, especially since the United States is a nation with many ethnicities. And that is a good thing. It's something that makes America better. It makes America strong. But we certainly want to understand what happened in other places with a lot of diversity and where it went wrong. And we can certainly say that South Africa's apartheid system went wrong somewhere. So today we want to talk about the background of the region, and we are going to do this in two parts. We're going to talk today about the native background of the area, and next week we're going to talk about the European background of the area, the early colonies. Today I've chosen to instead focus on the Zulu, and specifically their most famous leader, who you may have heard of before, Shaka Zulu. The Zulu were a division of the Bantu people. And of course, you remember the Bantu people as that group that left West Africa and expanded into much of sub-Saharan Africa, displacing the original inhabitants, such as the Pygmies and the Khoisan peoples, and pushing into East Africa and Southern Africa. The Zulu at first were a small tribe. In fact, by the year 1800, there probably were less than 10,000 Zulu total. So they were not a prominent tribe for most of African history. But in the course of approximately 25 years, from 1815 to 1840, they are going to grow into probably the best organized African state on the continent, and certainly the most successful in war. And they hold the distinction for sub-Saharan African peoples as really the only group that defeated a European army in a battle and came out victorious, although that didn't last for too long, unfortunately. The Zulu were eventually defeated by the British, but they did win a battle, and that is shocking to the Europeans, certainly, and is also worth our time to think about and talk about how exactly this came to pass. Now, the Zulu people, I think, are representative of many sub-Saharan African tribes and how they were during the period before European arrival in Africa. The Zulu were primarily agricultural based. We shouldn't be surprised by that. They were insular in the sense that they primarily looked to their own interests. They grew their own food, and there was relatively limited outside interaction. In fact, the only outside interaction that we can be clear on, and again, we don't have any written sources on this period, we have to rely on oral histories. The only real interactions that we are familiar with is warlike interactions or marriages, okay? And then, by the way, that is incredibly common. That is the standard for tribal societies. There's not long-distance trade, primarily because almost everyone produces very similar products. So the Zulu are growing the same thing as their neighbors, who are growing the same thing as them, right? There's no real reason to trade long distance in those conditions. It's really not until we see specialization that begins to occur. And the Zulu are small. We could talk about them as subsistence farmers. Okay, they're growing enough for themselves to live, and they're not really growing any more than that. Another thing to note about the Zulu is that their organizational structure, both politically and militarily, is also very representative of tribal cultures. And so it would benefit us to think about that. Effectively, the Zulu were organized into family units, and there was one noble family unit from which the chief of the entire Zulu people came from. And that's going to eventually become important because Shaka Zulu was related to this royal family, although he was an illegitimate child. So he had royal blood, but he was not legitimate and therefore was not heir to the throne. And really every person in the Zulu tribes, at least at the beginning, was related to one another. Eventually, this is not going to be true anymore for reasons that we'll talk about. But this is very standard. And again, if you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel, you'll remember his discussion about tribal organization. This tribal organization also extends itself to the warfare tactics of the Zulu. They really were not concerned with large-scale battles or winning in the sense that we might think of it. Because what you probably don't realize is that your conception of how wars are fought, if you ever even think about them, are really from a American or late European perspective. We tend to think of wars as having winners and losers, and one side that gets beaten basically loses their right to their territory or their right to determine things to a large extent. That has not been the standard throughout most of human history. There's usually been one of two types of warfare. There's been total warfare, in which case the victor takes absolutely everything, or there's limited warfare, where the war is fought and very limited goods are exchanged. And that's what the Zulu practiced, and that is common for most tribal peoples, although not all. Some tribes practice total warfare. And by the way, the West African slave societies, those would have been total warfare states. When they came in, they took most of your people as slaves, anybody that they could find anyway, and they would take them away. That's more total war. Okay, the loser loses everything. That's kind of the idea. And by the way, some examples of total war in the modern era would be, for example, World War II. That was a total war. Not only was every resource of the combatants being utilized. Okay, think about the United States production capability and Germany's production capability. But at the end of the war, Germany had no say in what happened. The United States, the Soviet Union, and the British basically rebuilt Germany the way that they wanted to, not the way that Germany wanted to. Okay, so that's total war. So the Zulu practiced very limited war. And in fact, it appears that among African tribes, they even practiced a severe form of limited war, in that they would go out and they would yell insults at each other, and they would exchange missile weapons. They would throw spears at each other, but there was almost no physical hand-to-hand fighting among Zulu tribes. And the reason for this is unknown. Again, we don't have any written sources. We just have historians and Zulu people's best guesses at why this was. But most people suspect that's because there really wasn't much to fight for. They did herd cattle that had actually been brought by the Europeans and escaped. But that was really about all that was valuable. And so whichever side retreated first after taking a couple injuries or a couple deaths, the other side would come steal their cows, maybe a couple women, and they would go back to their village. And this is very, very limited warfare. Warfare occurred very commonly because, again, I mean, when very few people die, or possibly even no one dies in these conflicts, you can have them quite often, and they can be used to settle other disputes in your peoples. And so this is the kind of standard for the Zulu all the way up into the 1800s. And I established this because Shaka Zulu not only reorganizes the Zulu politically, but he absolutely reorganizes them militarily, and that is going to be crucial to the story of the Zulu rise to power. Now, Shaka himself is really an interesting character. He was an illegitimate son of the Zulu king, and because of this, he was sent away with his mother to live in another tribe. Obviously, jealousies going on there. And Shaka was eventually promoted to be one of the captains of a group of soldiers. And at that time, the leader of that tribe realized that Shaka was of royal blood. That story kind of came out, and he realized that Shaka was a man that he wanted to cultivate. And so he promoted him until you can think of Shaka as the leader of all of this tribe's soldiers. Now, Shaka, for whatever reason, decided that he was going to reorganize the military efforts of the Zulu tribe, and he is going to be extraordinarily successful in this. Although he still keeps his innovations kind of close to his chest, he doesn't really use the tactics that he would later be famous for, primarily because he's fighting against his own people. He seemed to have a sense that he did not want to slaughter huge numbers of his own people, but he certainly brought a new level of warfare. First off, one of the things that Shaka did is he switched the weapon of his soldiers. Rather than use long throwing spears, approximately 7 feet long, which was the standard that the Zulus used, he instead switched to a very short stabbing spear. In fact, from point to the end of the stick, it was only about 3 feet long. In fact, in many ways, it was used more like a sword than it was a spear. You could swing it, although that was rare, and you could stab it kind of like a Roman gladius and do a lot of damage. These weapons were incredibly good in close quarters combat once you closed with your enemy. He also equipped his men with large cowhide shields, which he was able to block incoming missiles with. And remember that African soldiers were not usually well equipped with replacement weapons. So once they threw their spears at you, they probably didn't have many more to throw at you. And if they threw all their spears away, well, then they were really in trouble when you closed with them with that short stabbing spear. So Shaka trains his men, he retools his men, and he begins to use these new tactics to defeat some of his tribal leader's enemies. And that tribal leader eventually dies. He's replaced by his son, and Shaka swears loyalty to that son, and they've got a good thing going. Well, eventually the son sees an opportunity to place himself as king of all of the Zulu with Shaka's help. Shaka's father had died, and one of Shaka's half-brothers had been put on the throne, and Shaka certainly had no love lost for his half-brothers since he had been kicked out of his father's tribe. And so he returns and, with some of his associates, assassinates the king and his other half-brothers, leaving the throne open for someone who wanted to challenge it. And of course, Shaka's friend and ruler challenged and won the kingship of the Zulu. Unfortunately, though, this was not going to last very long. A neighboring tribe came in and killed the king and captured many of the cows and the women of the Zulu tribes, and leaving just Shaka basically as the only leader of the Zulu people. And this is where Shaka's skills as a leader are really going to shine through. Shaka decides, all right, now I'm going to be king and I am going to get revenge, and I'm not going to stop just with revenge. I am going to make the Zulu the most dominant force in Southern Africa. He's going to succeed at this. The thing that Shaka does is he brings an innovative new organization form to his forces. First off, he fights several battles among the Zulu themselves to basically unify everyone under his rule. So the 15 to 8,000 Zulu that existed at this time, again, no written history, so numbers are a little indistinct. I don't necessarily agree that Shaka's the king, so he has to beat a couple tribes to get everybody to kind of follow him. And then he takes the warriors that he now has control over and he uses them to go get revenge. And he does this by using an innovative new strategy that we call the buffalo horns, the buffalo head, and the buffalo loins. And here's how it worked. Shaka had three distinct groups of warriors that went to every battle. He had those that were in the head. The head's job was to charge directly at the enemy. They were going to charge directly at the enemy. They were going to lock them in place and keep them paying attention to them. Meanwhile, the horns would flank the enemy. That means they would go far to the right and the left of the enemy, oftentimes out of their sight. This was kind of a sneaking maneuver, and they would try and sneak all the way around the enemy, and then they would rush in from the sides, hopefully hitting the enemy from the sides and even some parts in the rear. And by doing this, what Shaka hoped to do, and this was often successful, is create a collapse. In fact, if you want to know the technical military term for what Shaka had discovered, is the double envelopment. The most famous use of the double envelopment of all time, at least in my opinion, is the usage of Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae, where he destroyed 80,000 Roman soldiers almost effortlessly once he got this thing set up. And the reason that this is so effective, and it's particularly effective when you're a melee combatant, when you're fighting with your hands and your weapons, is what happens is, first off, men tend to panic when they are attacked from multiple directions at once. And that is natural. If you can imagine yourself in a sword fight, okay, maybe let's make it less violent. It's a plastic lightsaber fight, and you're fighting one person, it's not so bad. But when a second person comes in from the side, you tend to react differently. You at least need to reorient yourself to fight both of them at once. So this tends to create some problems in enemy armies. And then as they move into melee with you, typically what happens is you move back, and that is a natural human reaction. It's very common. But again, this is not an area where you've got a handgun and you can fire it basically with any amount of space around you. As you get pushed back, you become less and less able to use your own weapons. And remember that the enemy tribes were not using Shaka's short stabbing spears. They were using long 7-foot weapons. And so the second that they get backed up into their friends, their weapons get tangled and they become less and less effective. And effectively what Shaka is able to do is he's able to compress and compress and compress until one of two things happens. He defeats the entire army and they throw down their weapons, or they break and run. And Shaka also made his men run 10 miles a day. And the reason for this is because not only did he want them to get to battle quickly, but according to Shaka's descendants, the reason that he actually did this was so they could chase down their enemies. There wasn't any limited war here anymore. You couldn't run away to fight another day. Shaka's troops would get you. They would hunt you down, they would grab you, and they would kill you. if you attempted to run. So Shaka uses these innovative tactics, and it's like wildfire. He just conquers his way across a bunch of southern Africa, sometimes called the Natal, and you can look up a map of where that is. Eventually, he goes from a tribe of approximately 8,000 people to a tribe of more than 250,000 people. And you might ask, how did he do this in the course of approximately 25 years from 1815 to 1840? Well, the way he did this was by bringing people into his tribe, or assimilation. This is something that I think as Americans we're not very familiar with, despite the fact that this is not only common for tribal peoples, but it's even common for Native American groups, in addition to African groups. And the way this worked is basically when you are defeated in war, okay, there's a couple options of what they can do to you. They can certainly take you as a slave. We've already talked about that process for quite a while, so we won't go into that again. But another thing that tribal groups tend to do is they tend to take someone and they tend to adopt them. Okay, and that seems like a strange thing to do to somebody defeated in battle. But if they have some skills that you want, or they are physically fit, and they are not opposed particularly to they were defeated, they were captured, but they didn't do anything really that damaged you. You might bring them into your tribe, and you might actually marry them off to one of your women. And once that has happened, once they are married off, certainly once they have children, they are effectively grafted into your tribe. I mean, he's not going to betray his own wife. He's not going to betray his own children. He's basically become part of the tribe. And it often surprises people that that happens. It makes a little bit more sense in women's case, right? The women are brought into the tribe. They're married off to somebody, and, they probably won't escape because they now have a life and they live with this guy. That's how people typically think it works. But actually, that was fairly uncommon. The typical response was to actually bring men in. And again, for most warlike cultures, the reason for this is clear. They needed more bodies to fight wars. And this works especially well if you're not continuously fighting the same group. Obviously, if you're fighting the same tribe again and again and again, this technique is not going to work because this guy you brought into your tribe is not going to fight loyally for you. But if you're fighting a bunch of different tribes, if you're conquering a bunch of different groups, then this tactic can work particularly well. And this allows the Zulu to go from a very small population to more than 250,000 in 25 years. This is not a natural population increase. This is the assimilation of other people into the Zulu Empire. Now, Shaka dies in 1840. Why he dies and how he dies is unclear. There are all sorts of theories out there on why Shaka died. Some people claim that he was killed in ritual combat. Some people claim that he was poisoned. Some people say that he just got sick from a European disease. It's not exactly clear what happened to Shaka. And despite the fact that many internet sources are going to say they know what happened to him, or they have a good theory. The reality is that there's a lot of different things that it could have been. And unfortunately, because of the lack of written records, we just have no way to clearly understand who and what happened to Shaka Zulu. Now, Shaka Zulu is replaced by one of his sons. He had many. And unfortunately, these sons have a new neighbor that is much more powerful than any of the tribes that they have fought in the past, and that is the British Empire. We are going to talk extensively about British history in South Africa, and we're going to talk about the Dutch settlers who were also in South Africa at the same time. So suffice to say that there was a large European population in South Africa. By the way, culturally, this transformed the Zulus in many ways. The Zulu agriculture of 1800 did not resemble in any way the Zulu agriculture in the 1840s. The Europeans had brought in a number of crops, and Southern Africa actually has a climate that does support European-style agriculture. So we're talking about wheat, we're talking about corn, potatoes, things like that. That being said, it is still Africa, and sometimes droughts especially can really ravage European crops. And so really what had happened is the agricultural production of Africa had skyrocketed, which is one of the reasons for this huge population increase. Nobody's dying of starvation anymore. The problem is that because of Africa's unique geography and climate, there was always the possibility of a drought, and that would lead to mass starvation because the only way to maintain these large populations is to continue to produce large amounts of food. So this is very problematic for the Zulu and requires them to still be in conflict because they're really looking for sources of water, areas that they can move people to that will allow them to support themselves long term. So they're really in a tough spot here. The reason this matters is this brings the Zulu into conflict with European farmers. European farmers who have very fertile land, access to water. The Zulu want these things. And there begin to be raids on European territory by Zulu warriors who are coming to take crops when their people are starving. They're coming to take water or set up outposts near water. And this begins to be a border conflict between the British and the Zulu. And from our best indication, and again, we have to take both sides account of what happened with a grain of salt, the British, because they obviously want the Zulus to be the bad guys and vice versa for the Zulus. Apparently there were some killings. It's not clear who started these killings. Okay, the Zulu, of course, claim the British started the killing. The British, of course, claim that the Zulu started the killing. And unfortunately, just like most border conflicts in history, the truth is probably much more complex. It was probably a situation that was bad on both sides. Somebody got nervous and somebody was killed. And again, who that was, it's not exactly clear. I would not feel comfortable even putting a guess that it was either group. Who knows? But it was one of the two. And this starts large-scale raiding by the Zulu on the British. And of course, the British cannot accept this. And so they mobilized several small armies to move into Zulu territory to conquer them. Actually, they would fight two wars with the Zulu. The first war, which we'll talk about today, was successful, but they did not wipe the Zulu out. They kind of made them a subordinate partner to them. And eventually, they decided to fully conquer the Zulu in the sense that they eliminated the Zulu's ability to be a military force. The reason that this war and this battle is interesting is because the Zulu actually successfully surprise the British in a battle. And this is a really ironic thing because there's actually two famous battles in the Zulu War, the first Zulu War, and one of them is a devastating British loss, and the second one is a fantastic British victory. And so let's talk about the loss first. The Zulu were able to use their bull head, horns, and loins idea. And by the way, I never explained what the loins were. The loins are simply the reserves. And if anybody is breaking through the Zulu lines, they're going to be thrown into that spot. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. The Zulu are going to use their infantry tactics to surprise the British. And the way they did this is they charged the British in open ground. But this open ground actually had two lines of hills on either side. And so the British, with all of their modern weapons and Gatling guns, were focused on the frontal charge of the Zulu, and they were shooting at them, and the frontal charge had kind of petered out. But because of the gunfire, at least that's the theory, they didn't hear the thousands of stamping feet of the Zulu as they got behind these hills. And again, on the signal of one of the Zulu leaders, the head charged another time. The British are focused on that. And the horns of the Zulu's trap charged over the hills and got into the British lines. And of course, once the Zulu got in and among the British, your large caliber weapons and your long range rifles aren't going to do you all that much good. So the Zulu are able to do devastating damage to the British, and almost the entire British regiment is wiped out. A few escape on horses, but this is a devastating defeat. And by the way, this also made the Zulu more dangerous because the Zulu now were well armed and equipped with weapons. And so they grabbed all of these weapons and they brought them with them. So this means that the next encounter with the Zulu has the potential to be much more dangerous. Unfortunately, the Zulu are they're confident now. They've won a victory against the British, and so they're going to try this technique again. This time they attack the British at a farmstead, at a settlement, and this time the British are much better prepared for them. First off, word of the massacre had kind of come out, and a basic understanding of the Zulu battle tactics had come about, and this time the British simply posted men on the sides for when this flanking attack came. And so again, the Zulu attempted to charge the British center, and they were thrown back just as they had been in the previous battle. But this time, when their horns charged out of the darkness, because this battle happened in the evening, they were immediately gunned down by British forces on the left and the right. So unfortunately, this second battle does not go the Zulu way. In fact, some estimates say as many as 3,000 to 5,000 Zulu are killed in the battle. And by the way, thousands of Zulu had been killed in the previous battle, because while the British had lost, they had certainly killed more Zulu than the Zulu had killed of them. That is the difference between firearms and melee weapons. Unfortunately, with this loss, the Zulu had lost the ability to form armies large enough to have a chance at defeating the British. They needed huge numbers of troops and surprise to win, and they had lost huge numbers of troops, and in many ways they had lost surprise. And so the Zulu are forced to sue for peace, and the British basically moved them back away from British borders. And eventually, the British kind of manufacture a second war to kind of de-arm or de-weaponize the Zulu. And unfortunately, we just don't have time to go into that information. Finally, let's talk about the Zulu today. The Zulu today actually inhabit many areas of southern Africa, not just South Africa. They inhabit parts of Zimbabwe. They inhabit parts of Zambia. Actually, the village that our missionary at FBC works with, they are majority Zulu. In fact, many of their last names are Zulu. And I was able to talk to a Zulu historian by the name of Dixon Zulu while I was in that village. He taught history in Zambia for years. And so the Zulu peoples spread out over southern Africa in several different directions. So the Zulu people today are still alive and strong. They still have a distinct cultural identity as well in several different areas. So the Zulu survive, but unfortunately, the Zulu are probably most famous after the British victory of being part of the apartheid situation in South Africa. And to discuss that in detail, we will have to wait until we talk about apartheid next week. Hopefully, you guys have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.